Janet Price knew she was making the biggest mistake of her life the moment her hand rose in the air. The auction barn was loud, packed with buyers shouting bids and horses crying from the pens. But somehow the world felt cold and still around her. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to be spending the last $300 she had left. She wasn't supposed to be risking everything she had fought to hold together. But she had already done it. Her hand was up. Her bid was placed. And now every eye in the room turned toward the single mom in the back row who clearly had no business buying a horse. Janet felt her heart slam against her ribs as the auctioneer called out the numbers. The foal in the ring stood thin and trembling under the bright lights, each rib showing through his dirty coat. He looked lost, confused, and far too young to understand what was happening. She'd seen plenty of neglected horses in her childhood on her father's ranch, but something about this one made her freeze. She had only stepped into the pen for a moment, just to look, just to touch, just to feel the quiet strength under all that sorrow. But the moment her hand met his thin neck, she knew walking away would break her in ways she couldn't explain. The bidding stalled, and the kill buyer in the front row kept raising his finger with an uncaring flick. Janet couldn't outbid him. She shouldn't even have tried. But then the auctioneer paused, squinted at a note handed to him, and announced the one rule that changed everything. No kill buyers allowed for animals under 6 months. The man stood, scowled, and walked straight out of the barn. Suddenly, the only real bid left was Janet's. And just like that, with one fall of the auctioneer's hammer, the starving foal became hers. She sat frozen in her metal folding chair long after the auctioneer called sold, while the crowd murmured around her. She had done it. She had bought a horse, with money she needed for bills, with no place to put him, with no plan, with no safety net. She walked to the payment office with shaky steps, handed over her last $300, and signed her name on the ownership papers for a dapple gray colt with no papers and no history. When she met him outside, the foal stood quietly, watching her with sad but curious eyes. "Your name is Apollo," she whispered, touching his cheek. "We're going to figure this out." The barn worker loaded him into the borrowed trailer, shaking his head as he did. "You'll have your hands full with this one," he warned. Janet nodded because she already knew that. She just didn't know how much her life was about to change. Driving the trailer back toward town, her thoughts tangled like wild roots in dry soil. Rent was due soon. Bills were stacked on her kitchen counter. Her car needed new tires. She had Celeste to think of. Sweet, bright 7-year-old Celeste, who deserved stability, not a mother making reckless decisions. But the moment she pictured her daughter's face when she learned they had a horse, a tiny spark of hope flickered in Janet's chest. The temporary stable she found was barely standing, with old wood and broken gates, but it was all she could afford. She helped Apollo into his stall, watching him lower his head toward the hay with slow, weak movements. He was so thin it hurt to look at him. His coat was rough, his breathing uneven, his legs too long for his body. But Janet had felt good bone structure beneath the dirt, seen the promise in the way he'd watched her. If he lived long enough to grow into himself, he could be something special. Janet stayed with him longer than she intended, brushing mud from his coat, cleaning his water bucket, checking every inch of his fragile frame. Each small movement deepened her fear. He needed expensive care. He needed food. He needed medicine. He needed time she didn't have and money she couldn't spare. She stood in that stall with her forehead pressed to Apollo's shoulder and whispered, "I don't know how I'm going to do this." That night, back in their tiny apartment, Janet tried to hide her worry from Celeste. When she finally told her daughter about Apollo, Celeste's face lit up with pure joy. "We have a horse!" she gasped, jumping into Janet's arms. "Mama, we really have a horse?" Janet nodded, and a feeling of warmth filled her chest despite the fear clawing at her. Celeste had been dreaming of horses for years, watching videos on their old laptop, reading every library book she could carry. Janet had always promised someday. Now someday had arrived in the form of a starving foal who depended on her for everything. But lying in bed that night, with Celeste asleep beside her, the weight of what she'd done pressed down hard. The numbers didn't add up. The bills wouldn't stretch. The cost of the stall alone would swallow everything. She closed her eyes and tried to steady her breathing. In the morning, she told herself she would call the auction house and ask if returns were possible. She would undo this. She had to. Morning came, and with it came her daughter's excited voice, asking when they could go see Apollo again. Janet opened her mouth to say they couldn't keep him, to explain why, to be rational, to be responsible. But when she saw the hope in Celeste's eyes, the words wouldn't come. Instead, she grabbed her keys and drove them straight to the stable. Apollo lifted his head when they approached, eyes softer today, as if he remembered Janet's gentle touch. Celeste pressed her hands against the stall bars, smiling so wide her cheeks hurt. "Hi, Apollo," she whispered. "I'm Celeste. I'm going to help you get better." Janet felt something shift inside her. A choice had been made. There was no going back now. The next few weeks pushed Janet harder than anything she had faced before. Every day felt like a race she was running uphill with no finish line in sight. She woke before dawn for her morning shift at the diner, dropped Celeste at school, then drove straight to the stable to clean Apollo's stall and feed him. After picking Celeste up, they spent 2 hours brushing the colt, walking him gently, and checking his breathing. Then they headed to Janet's evening cleaning jobs, where Celeste did her homework in the car under the dim glow of a dome light. By the time they reached home, both of them were too tired to do anything but fall into bed. Apollo struggled at first. The veterinarian diagnosed worms, infections, and a respiratory problem that made his breathing rough and uneven. The bill was more than Janet could handle, and the payment plan added another monthly expense to an already impossible budget. Some nights she lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering what kind of mother risked everything for a horse. But then she'd see Apollo fighting to stand stronger each day, and Celeste rubbing circles on his thin neck, whispering that he was brave. Janet reminded herself why she did it. She wasn't just saving a horse, she was trying to save hope. As the months passed, Apollo changed slowly but surely. His coat grew clean and soft. His ribs stopped showing. His legs grew sturdy. His once dull eyes began to shine. By 8 months old, he was no longer the weak, trembling foal she had bought at the auction. He had turned into a beautiful young horse with dapples forming across his gray coat like silver clouds. Even the boarders at the rundown stable stopped to stare at him. "That's a good horse," one of them said. "Someone spent money breeding his parents." Janet tried to hide her pride. "He didn't come with papers." "Doesn't matter, look at that hind end. That's a cow horse if I've ever seen one." Celeste grew right along with Apollo. She spent so much time brushing him that he began nickering whenever he heard her footsteps. Their bond was so strong that even the roughest days felt lighter when they were together. Apollo rested his head on Celeste's shoulder, as if he trusted her more than the world itself. That trust kept Janet pushing forward, even when bills piled up and every paycheck disappeared before she could blink. But reality didn't care about hope. Janet's budget was a constant puzzle that never had a correct answer. Her car broke down again. Celeste needed school supplies. Rent crept higher. Janet considered selling Apollo more times than she could count. She researched auctions, talked to trainers, asked about buyers. Every time she got close to making a decision, she'd see the way Apollo watched Celeste. Or she'd stand in his paddock in the quiet of the evening and feel him lean gently into her side. She couldn't do it. She just couldn't. The turning point came one warm afternoon when Apollo was 18 months old. Janet was working him in the round pen, teaching him basic commands. She'd grown up doing this with her father, and the rhythm of training brought memories she thought she had lost forever. But Apollo learned faster than any horse she had ever known. He didn't just obey, he understood. He anticipated, he thought. A woman named Vivian, a professional cutting horse trainer who boarded a mare at the stable, stopped at the fence, and watched silently. When the session ended, she walked over, eyes sharp with interest. "Where'd you get this horse?" she asked. "An auction," Janet said, embarrassed. He didn't have papers. Quote, Vivian's eyebrows rose. "He moves like a horse bred for cutting. He's got cow sense. Natural cow sense. You can't teach that. It's in the blood." Janet shrugged. "I don't have money for real training." "What if you didn't have to pay?" Vivian asked. "I need a project horse. Something to showcase what my program can do. In exchange for letting me train him and use him for demonstrations, I'll cover the training costs. I'll even give you reduced board at my place. Apollo stays yours. Always?" Janet stared at her, unsure if she heard right. "Why would you do that?" Vivian smiled softly. "Because that's a special horse. And because I was a single mom once. I know what it feels like to choose between dreams and survival." Janet accepted. Apollo moved to Vivian's small but well-kept facility, and everything changed. His training was slow, patient, and professional. He blossomed under the new routine. Vivian guided him through early cow work, and Apollo took to it like he had been born for it. The way he tracked cattle made experienced trainers stop talking mid-sentence. His turns were quick, his focus razor-sharp, his instincts uncanny. By the time he was 3, Apollo was competing in small local shows. Even without papers, he placed high against seasoned horses. People noticed. They asked questions. Where did he come from? Who bred him? What's his lineage? Janet could only answer, "I don't know." But the truth was finally about to catch up to them. A video of Apollo at a competition made its way online. 3 weeks later, Janet received a phone call from a name she recognized instantly. William Cavanaugh, a respected cutting horse breeder whose name appeared in every magazine she'd ever read growing up. "I saw your gray horse," he said, "and I'm certain he's one of mine." Janet felt her knees weaken. "How can you know?" "I know my bloodlines," he said. "That horse moves like Silver Apollo, one of my best stallions. And he looks exactly like Moonlight Star, the mare I sold years ago. If we test his DNA, I bet we'll have a match." 4 weeks later, the results came back. Apollo had a pedigree worth more than Janet had ever dreamed of. And everything in her life was about to change forever. The day the DNA results arrived, Janet sat on the porch of her small rental apartment holding the envelope with shaking hands. Celeste sat beside her, now 12 years old, her legs swinging nervously as she whispered, "Mama, open it." Janet tore the seal and pulled out the paperwork. The first line hit her like a sudden gust of wind. Apollo's parentage was confirmed. He was the grandson of Silver Apollo and the son of Moonlight Star. Both horses were legends in the cutting horse world. His bloodlines ran deep with champions, each generation stronger than the last. Janet pressed a hand to her mouth. She had known Apollo was special, but this was something beyond anything she imagined. William called moments later, voice trembling with pride. "Janet, you have a horse worth more than $100,000, maybe more. His pedigree is unmatched. You didn't just save a foal, you saved a champion." Janet felt the world spin. She walked outside to the pasture where Apollo grazed peacefully, unaware that his value had just changed their lives forever. Offers started coming almost immediately. Vivian's clients wanted him, ranchers wanted him, breeders wanted him. People offered $80,000, then $100,000, then $150,000. Each time Janet saw a new number, her breath caught. She could buy a house, pay off debts, build a future for Celeste. It was enough money to erase every struggle they had survived. But every time she pictured selling Apollo, she saw the way Celeste hugged him, how the stallion lowered his head to her like she was part of his herd. Celeste stood in front of her one evening, eyes earnest and afraid. "Mama, are you going to sell him?" Janet knelt in front of her, brushing a loose curl from her daughter's forehead. "Baby, that money could help us. It could change everything." Celeste shook her head hard. "Apollo is our family. Please don't let him go." The choice hurt in both directions, but one truth was stronger than the rest. Apollo had saved them as much as they had saved him. Janet couldn't break that bond. Instead of selling him, she sat down with Vivian at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee and a new idea. They would start a breeding program. Apollo would become a stallion whose bloodlines could help shape the future of cutting horses. His stud fees would bring in steady income. Janet could keep him and still give Celeste the life she deserved. Vivian agreed without hesitation. "He's too good to sell," she said. "Let's build something with him." Their first breeding season was more successful than they ever expected. 8 mares were booked in the first few months. The income from stud fees alone changed everything. With her share of the earnings, Janet made a bold move. She approached the owners of a small, run-down property she had admired for years. 50 acres, an old barn, a sagging house, and a forgotten arena. The owners lived out of state and were eager to sell. Janet offered a small down payment and owner financing. They accepted. She was terrified. But she was also determined. The ranch needed work. A lot of work. Janet rebuilt the fences one board at a time. She patched the barn roof until it no longer leaked. She cleared brush, repaired stalls, fixed wiring, and replaced windows. She painted the house inside and out, ripped up rotting floorboards, installed new cabinets, and learned skills she never dreamed she'd need. It took years, but each improvement brought the place back to life. Celeste helped every step of the way, becoming stronger and more confident with every nail she hammered. Apollo continued to grow into his power. By the time he was 6, his stud book was full every season. His offspring showed the same intelligence, balance, and cow sense that made him so special. Trainers from across the country called Janet, eager to buy or compete with Apollo's colts and fillies. The breeding operation expanded. Janet hired 2 workers, then 3. The ranch took on boarding horses, training horses, and eventually became a respected name in the cutting horse world. Celeste began competing on Apollo, and the stallion carried her to victories as naturally as he breathed. She won regional contests, then state competitions, and eventually earned a full scholarship to a major equestrian program. Apollo wasn't just a horse. He was the reason Celeste's future was wide open. When Celeste turned 18, the ranch was no longer just a place they lived. It was a thriving home, a business, a legacy. The rundown 50 acres were now worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The breeding program earned 6 figures a year. Janet had quit both of her old jobs long ago. Apollo's name was known across the cutting horse industry. On Apollo's 15th birthday, dozens of people gathered at the ranch to celebrate. Trainers, breeders, buyers, friends, and neighbors filled the arena stands. Even William Cavanaugh traveled from Oklahoma to attend. He walked through the barn with tears in his eyes, watching Apollo's offspring work cattle with the same grace and instinct their sire possessed. He rested a hand on Apollo's strong neck. "This horse changed the sport," he said, "and he almost didn't make it past his first year. You saved him, Janet. You saved a bloodline." Janet shook her head. "He saved me first." As the sun set, the celebration quieted. Guests drifted home. Silhouettes of horses grazed in the golden light. Janet stayed behind in the barn, brushing Apollo's coat. His dapples shimmered like soft silver under the warm glow of the setting sky. He leaned his head against her shoulder, the same gentle way he had the day she bought him. She whispered, "Everyone said I was crazy. Everyone said it wouldn't work. But look at us now. The ranch, the horses, the life she built from nothing. It all began with a starving foal in a forgotten pen. A foal no one wanted. A foal she couldn't walk away from. Sometimes the smallest choices open the biggest doors. Sometimes the most reckless decisions become the most beautiful stories. And sometimes, when you save something broken, it stitches your own life back together." Apollo had been her $300 gamble. He became her greatest treasure.